Can you see? Okay, thank you, everyone. So if you want to interrupt, I'm happy to answer any questions. So today what I'm going to do is present this paper that is called Contemporary Wage Incentives Increase Formal Employment. That is a work I have been doing with Martin Abel, Elena Carranza, and Kimberly Geronimo. It's about an experiment we did we have been doing in Mexico for 2 years. So I will present early results from a wage subsidy pilot in Mexico to encourage upper secondary school graduates to seek and stay in formal sector jobs. In general, we know that governments are trying to increase employment for various reasons, including to shift people into productive sectors and have them covered by regulation and social security. So the government approached to us a couple of years ago, and we started designing this to also try to address the problem with the poverty that cash transfer beneficiaries were still facing. So to motivate this study, I will show you 2 facts. The first is on wages. These graphs use nationally representative data and show you that the difference in hourly wages between the formal and informal sector. So we can see there is a difference between these entrance wages. So now imagine you are an 18 years old who have just graduated from high school and you are entering the labor market. And then you have to decide between entering the informal sector or the formal sector. What 2 things jump out? First, that the starting wages in the formal sector are lower, about 10% lower, as indicated by the negative initial difference in the graph. And second, there is a much larger wage growth in the formal employment, as evidenced by the positive slope. After 1 year on the job, formal jobs pay 20% more. But what the people are seeing is just the entry wage. What this can suggest is that you might choose an informal job entering, either because you focus on the starting wage, because you have a discount, because you discount future benefits, or you are not aware of the wage growth. Interestingly, this seems very specific to young cohorts. So if we see the one in the left, we are seeing that for 21 to 24 years old, we still see large wages compared to the 18 to 20, but they are less pronounced. And even starting wages are higher for this group. The second fact is that informal jobs are less stable and not stepping stone for formal jobs. Here, what I'm showing you is a transition matrix. The first thing to notice is that the informal employment is the dominant entry point in the labor market for this age group. You can see also that if you are in informal work, you are almost twice as likely to be out of work in the next period. And only about 10% of informal workers transition to formal work. So what your starting job at in this point of life is going to be a huge determinant for your labor trajectory. This points 2 important objectives of the policy. First, we needed to reduce the flow of low-income youth into more precarious informal employment by supporting their transition from school to formal jobs. And second, within the formal sector, there is a need to address low retention to allow youth to experience great wage growth. In this context, we asked whether a temporary wage incentive could put upper secondary school graduates in a better employment pathway by encouraging them to seek and stay in formal sector jobs. We designed and implemented a wage incentive intervention in San Luis Potosí, a state in central Mexico. And we worked with almost 2,000 low-income students who were graduating at that point from upper secondary education across 13 schools located within a 80-kilometer radius from the state industrial area. Notably, 55% of these students were planning to work just after graduating. They were at that point between 17 and 18 years old, half were female, and few had formal job experience. There were a lot that had some sort of informal job experience. So between April and May of 2019, that is 1 or 2 months before students graduate, we visit the schools, conducted a baseline survey, and had a basic 1-hour employment workshop for all students. So they all have the same information. Half of them were then randomized to be eligible for a wage incentive offer. And we followed them over the next 2 years using a combination of surveys and administrative data. We had also high-frequency SMS to track their employment status or education status. The deadline had just been completed at the end of August, so we are still analyzing that information. What I'm showing now is mainly based on Social Security data. So how is this incentive designed? So we offer a top-up wage subsidy that is about 20% equivalent to a 20% wage increase over the mean formal job wage, that is about 4,000 pesos, and is paid off for up to 6 months directly to the beneficiary, and is not observable for the employers, and it can be claimed on a rolling basis. So how did we come up with the 20%? Well, if you look at the wage graph from an entry salary for the formal employment, you will see that after 6 months, the wage increase exceeds the magnitude of the incentive. So we're seeing about a 25% increase in the wages after 6 months. And that's why we offer them the 20%, because it was something that was sustainable once they had this wage growth. So figure 2 shows the average wage growth from formally employed people in our study population of school leavers. In order to test how much of the observed wage growth is driven by the firm selection over time, we show wages increases separately for people who exit in a given month, that's the light part, and the ones that are returning the job, that's the dark bar. First, there is a substantial wage growth at the beginning of the school leaver's career. After 6 months, wages have increased by 25%. So jumping quickly to the main results of what we are finding at this point, without including the deadline, but with all the other data that we have. First, we are seeing that the offer of the wage incentive has a positive short-term impact on the probability of being formally employed. So what we are randomizing here is only the offer to the wage incentive. So we know that some of them were not continuing to the formal sector and they were continuing to education. So we are talking about the offer of the incentive. We are seeing that the effect is larger for youth that are mainly in the medium and low socioeconomic status and those who attended the technical track schools. So most of the effect is from the technical school students. We are also seeing that the wage incentive offer has a positive impact on the job stability of the formal labor market. And that is talking about the type of employment contract and the type and the employment tenure. Some of the underlying mechanisms we're finding is that there are binding reservation wages that are constraining people's career choices. We are seeing there is an underestimation of formal sector wage growth and an undervaluing of the benefits of formality. So talking about the formal employment, here is a month-to-month effect of the intervention. As I was saying, we are tracking high frequency information through SMS. The wage incentive result is resulting in a higher probability of having a formal job, up to 5 percentage points, which is about 20% above the formal employment rate for the control group. The effect takes a few months to show up, and perhaps because it takes some time to find a job after graduating. So if we are tracking information since January, then we randomize at May, but they basically finish around July their education. The effect of the incentive is greater for youth who at baseline, as we are seeing in the second graph, reported plans to work after graduating from school. And the intervention did not lead to changes in the employment for those planning to continue the education. So there are no unintended consequences in this group, as some were worried about. Talking about the employment by the type of contract. So the effect on formal employment is exclusively driven by an increase in the share of youth with permanent contracts, particularly among those who plan to work at baseline. The month-by-month impacts on the permanent employment contracts follow the same pattern as I showed you previously, but they are larger and persistent even after 2 years. So if you see, they are very small, but after 2 years, we're still seeing these effects. There are some holes here because of the closing of the firms due to the COVID pandemic. Meanwhile, the share of the people with temporary contracts stays basically unchanged, even for those that plan to work. So jumping quickly into the cumulative employment effects, we see that they are very stable over 1 and 2 years from the intervention. We can also see that the wage incentive increases the time in formal employment, and this is driven by an increase in the time spent on jobs with permanent contracts. This effect is larger after 2 years, suggesting that even when employment rates converge, the incentive leads to difference in work experience. So remember that this is only a 6-month incentive. So we're seeing effects even 2 years after. This increase in job experience is not only driven by an increase in the share of people with permanent contracts, but also by the modest reduction on a turnover among those with temporary contracts. We are seeing that treatment effects can operate in 2 ways: getting more people into work, the results I showed you before, and conditional on working, increasing the retention. So there was a group that was already working, and we see an increase in the retention. Here I show you the result from a Cox proportional hazard model. And what we are seeing is that of those that are working, how many are still employed after X months? So here is, for example, how many are employed after 14 months in a permanent job. We can see that the treatment group is the line, the solid line, the dashed line is consistently above the control group for this case, the temporary group. Another thing to note is that overall turnover is very high. So we are seeing that about 50% are still employed after a year in the same place. It is important that we think about why treatment effects might dissipate over time. Jumping onto the effects by the reservation wage group based on the baseline, we also see some difference. So one mechanism underlying effects of these underlying effects seem to be the reservation wages at baseline. At baseline, the average reservation wage is like 20% above the average starting wage in formal jobs, in particularly jobs from lower socioeconomic status report higher reservation wages. This is what we find when we divide our sample by baseline reservation wages. The treatment effects are largest for the workers in the third quartile. This group has reservation wages up to 20% above the mean starting salary. Precisely, this group should be most affected by the incentive if reservation wages are varied. And interesting, the formal employment effect for this group is masking a larger switching from temporary to permanent contracts jobs. So as I mentioned, we have just finished collecting endline data. We hope to learn more about whether the formal employment impacts are driven by people who leave the informal sector. And we hope that the endline will also give us will allow us the importance of other mechanisms. For example, something we are doing now is exploring whether youth are unaware of the benefits of permanent formal employment, or we are doing some tests with the discount to see if they might be driven by the discount of future benefits very heavily. We hope that this will allow us to inform the best design of wage incentives and other programs aimed to increase employment and retention. Something we are doing also to complement this, other than exploring these mechanisms and including the informal sector employment, because most of the data we have is from the Social Security at this point, is to have some qualitative data. So we're doing interviews with participants and firms to understand some of the decisions and the mechanisms behind. We also want to continue with this administrative data to see longer run effects. And we are trying to do this cost benefit analysis to see which are the cumulative effects of this intervention. So I think I finished a couple of minutes early, so that's great.
Yeah, you're a bit early, just 5 minutes early. That means we have 10 minutes for discussions. You're free to manage as you wish. People can raise their hands, or you do your thing.
Yes, Guillermo.
Hi, Maria Elena. Congratulations for this work. It's clearly a very important topic in the region, and very interesting and original intervention. I wanted to ask you if you have thought about potential, let's say, negative spillovers or contamination or displacement effects, between the treated and the control groups, given that this was if I understand well, it was a very localized intervention in a particular city, and since this control and treatment, if I understand well, they belong to the same school. Maybe there could be some competition in the local labor market. I was wondering if you have thought about that. Maybe if you could, for instance, maybe if you have rich administrative data, maybe use other cities as non-experimental analysis to compare how these controls are doing with compared with similar populations to evaluate this type of concern.
Thank you, Guillermo. So yeah, what we have some administrative data, and we are using mostly the service information for these groups. There is an employment survey that is a rolling panel. So we are using it to check some things from other states. But regarding the contamination, we did it, we did another pilot, and we realized it was very little the risk of contamination, because we were entering the schools at the end of the school year, just 1 month before they graduated. So what we're seeing is that after they graduated, most of them, they didn't have any contact. And because, so they leave schools and they don't see their classmates. There are very big schools. Some of them, they even have like 300 students per grade. So there are large schools, and we were very transparent at all time. So we did the randomization, and we actually give each student a letter saying if they were randomly assigned or not to this incentive. But yes, there is always a risk of contamination. And also what we are trying to track down is why there are some students, well, some youth that were offered the incentive. We know that they are working in a formal job, and they didn't ask for the incentive. So we are exploring all these things with data now about contamination as much as we can. Yes, Lorenzo.
Hi, thank you, Maria Elena. So I had a question. It seems like everything that, if I understand correctly, like the intervention is kind of designed to be like a fully labor supply effect, right? The employers do not know, that someone is getting a subsidy or something like that. So I guess my question is in what sense can something like this be kind of sustainable in equilibrium? Is the idea to think of this as a policy that a government may be interested in implementing and maintaining, sort of saying like, I'm essentially going to raise wages for people that go in the informal sector, and not let like employers know, because otherwise, like once you transition it to like the employers, let's say force employers to somehow, the idea that the reservation wages are too low, you could think it's because of, I don't know, monopoly power or something like that. It could be explaining the fact that the wages are too low. But when that comes into place, then you could have it like weird equilibrium effects. So what's kind of like your angle, I guess, with this question and this intervention?
Yeah, so one thing we were seeing is what is so the implication had to do with their starting wages, and a lot of information for people about the long run. So if they only see the starting wage and they don't see the benefits of it, they are for sure going to the informal job, which is also offering them flexibility. So something we did was this information workshop, but we saw that it was not enough. And there is a lot of misperception of what is a formal job. When we ask these participants, what is a formal job, they basically say is a job you have to go wearing a suit or a tie. That was the answer.
So the idea is essentially like these like youth in your setting, they are essentially only driven by the initial wage. They're myopic in the sense that they don't care about wage growth. Even if you provide an information intervention in that sense, you wouldn't see a reaction. So you essentially have to sort of like nudge them or push them over by kind of like providing the subsidy.
So what we were trying to do is basically nudge them, as you were saying, so they can start checking for options in the formal job, and to realize that they had different things. So what we're seeing also is that those that were offered, at least not all of them were in the formal sector, but at least they start looking for options in the formal sector. So and they start looking outside of the near social networks. So they start finding other opportunities, because the standard thing was to go and work in the same thing that the dad was working. And yeah, we're still trying to see what to do with this, because we know that it's not sustainable to give incentives to everyone, although that's a policy in Mexico, give incentives to everyone. And then, well, we are still figuring out, but there are very interesting things going on with the underlying mechanisms.
Great. So I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
And then we'll switch phones.
Yes, Jaime?
Hi, I just was wondering about the implications in terms of like education. So you showed that basically the people that wanted to, there was no difference in the treatment between people that, for the group that did want to study. So should we understand this, that like short-run liquidity constraints are not really an issue for these populations or this specific population? Because in some way what you are increasing is the opportunity cost of like of studying just after school. So even though you didn't find like an effect on this group, like when you think about expanding this in terms of public policy, I would be a little bit worried about like this kind of like externality from the program.
Yeah, we have to check that. Although what we're saying a lot is that they don't change the plans, basically because those that are working, a couple of them are basically working to get money to then study. So what we have in the online data, we have exactly the trajectories for education and job and work for 2 years, and we are trying to see that. But what we are seeing is that it's more likely that they change from trying to study to work because they were not accepted at school, more than because of the incentive. So that's what we are saying. The incentive is something that they mostly realize once they had a job. So those that are not in looking for a job, they have it just in their pocket. So something we did is we give everyone the card where we deposit the incentive, so they were aware they can get that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Elena. That was a great presentation. So we're moving on to the second one, which is my presentation. So in fact, or I'll be presenting it. So this is joint work with Laura Durham Core at Princeton, François Girard at Queen Mary, and Claire Montelou at UC Berkeley. In fact, we made 2 submissions to this conference, and both were lumped in the same session. So apologies for annoying you. So Claire will be presenting right after this one. So this paper is essentially about collective bargaining, wage floors, and the racial earnings gap. There's kind of like a recent interest again in the idea of unions and collective bargaining and how they impact inequality. So a recent kind of review or re-exploration of the impact of unions in the US shows that they did reduce inequality at their peak in the mid-20th century. And there are also other papers that show that collective bargaining can reduce between group inequality. So this paper by Biasi and Sarsens basically looks at right to work laws in the US and how it impacts the gender gap among teachers. And they show that in fact these right to work laws that kind of reduce the scope for collective bargaining kind of widened the gender gap. But the evidence of their impact on racial gaps is actually quite mixed. The important paper here is Aschenfelter 1972, where he found that the exclusion of Black workers from unions, and in particular craft unions, kind of offset the higher wage premiums that Black workers obtain in the US. So that is, a Black worker, conditional on being in a union, will kind of have a higher wage premium than the white worker. But simply the fact that in the case of these craft unions, that they're just simply excluding Black workers from their membership offsets that result, and to the extent that you actually see an increase in the wage gap among these types of unions. So these differentials in coverage and the premiums are kind of the key kind of features to think about how unions and collective bargaining affect the racial earnings gap. All of this evidence that I pointed here is kind of US focus, but there are other post-slavery societies where we don't have a lot of evidence on the impact of unions. and particular economies where collective bargaining kind of play a more substantial role than in the case of the US, where collective bargaining, since the 1950s, it's kind of like unions have been in a decline in the US. So we study the impact of collective bargaining and inequality in the racial earnings gap in Brazil. So it's essentially what the paper is doing. And the reason why we focus on Brazil is it's a major post-slavery economy that has really great administrative data that allows us to kind of follow employees across time and observe their wages. It's also a country that has substantial and persistent racial inequality. So the adjusted wage gaps in Brazil are kind of similar to those of the US, but this is a country where more than 50% of the population can be considered non-white. And for the purposes of this presentation, non-white is going to refer to Black and brown individuals. So what we do is we scrape the universe of collective bargaining agreements and link those to the establishments of coverage, that way allowing us to kind of like, in addition to tracking workers from job to job and observe their earnings, we also get to observe kind of the set of amenities that are provided by these CBAs. And the first thing we do is to describe sort of the union landscape for each racial group in Brazil, see how union density and CBA coverage is kind of evolving over time, and then basically look at these two components, the racial differentials in coverage versus premiums and their contribution to the earnings gap in Brazil. And then the main part of the paper, as it's currently written, analyzes a key union policy, which are going to be the wage floors. Wage floors are essentially minimum wages that the union negotiates with employers, and they apply to the workers at a given establishment. So we use these wage floors and we answer the following questions, how do they impact employment and earnings by racial group? What is the impact of the wage floors on inequality in general? And then what are the mechanisms behind the effects we observe? So to summarize kind of the results of the paper, we actually find that unlike the US, collective bargaining in Brazil is associated with a 2.5 log point larger racial earnings gap. So it's about 10% of the unadjusted gap. And this is essentially driven by differentials in premium. So again, unlike the US, conditional on being coverage by a CBA in Brazil, white workers are actually better off than non-white workers. So why is that the case? It kind of like poses this puzzle. Why are white workers benefiting more even when non-white workers tend to have the lower paying jobs? So that kind of motivates us to think about wage floors. There's a policy that is targeted towards low earners that the union is negotiating, and that we can kind of like study in great detail, kind of leveraging the really extensive literature on minimum wages. So similar to a big chunk of the literature on minimum wages, it's still in debate. There are many papers on this, but we find null employment effects from increases in wage floors. And one of the neat things that we can contribute in this regard is that since we observe the set of amenities that are provided by these CBAs, we can rule out the potential explanation that an increase in the wage floor is kind of paired with a decrease in some sort of amenity, and then that would explain why you would see null employment effects. We actually don't see any evidence of that. We do find that with the wage floor increase, the earnings distribution compresses from below. So in putting that in numbers, the 50 to 10 log earnings ratio falls by 6%. And we find no impact on the racial gaps. And one of the reasons why we see nothing kind of occurring at the mean is that the wage floors are kind of differentially binding by race. That is, we see if a wage floor increases, we see more non-white workers, and white workers are actually kind of earning below the wage floor. So then we want to think about the mechanisms. Why does that happen? So what we find actually is it seems that something that's happening through hires. We find that non-white hires are overrepresented just below the wage floor, whereas white hires are overrepresented just above it. And we see that this is not explained by occupation fixed effects, which kind of suggests that it's not really about the union policy, that is that the wage floor is targeting a specific occupation, and that specific occupation tends to have majority white workers, but rather that it's something about enforcement, weak enforcement in the setting. So kind of to link the analysis of the wage floor to kind of our motivation about unions and inequality, we kind of in some sense conclude that wage floors are unlikely to diminish this premium gap, and that definitely enforcement could help to kind of reduce inequality more. It's an open question whether that's something that's feasible. But that's kind of the quick summary of the paper. So I'll start in the talk by basically talking about the setting. I'm going to skip the results about kind of inequality, the replication of Ashenfelter 1972 to Brazil, and just explain kind of the wage floor part of the paper in more detail. So just to set some ideas, in Brazil, there's universal CBA coverage. So that means that you don't have to be a union member in order to be covered by a CBA. So that means kind of like the two main statistics to think about the relevance of unions in a country is one is union density, which is the share of workers that are members, and the other one is CBA coverage, which is the share of workers that are covered by some CBA. So in the case of Brazil, CBA coverage is going to be the relevant statistic. Now, regardless of which way you see it, both of these statistics are kind of decreasing over time, kind of indicating kind of a decrease in union power in Brazil. But the nice thing, and completely opposite to what we see in the US, there's more than half of the private formal workforce is covered by some CBA. And interestingly, in the case of Brazil, it's a very fragmented union structure. So you have almost 11,000 unions that are negotiating, which generates a lot of variation in the types of CBAs you observe in this setting. So the data we use is essentially the universe of these CBAs, which are kind of registered on this online system where clauses are already pre-categorized. So it's very easy to identify which ones are the wage floor clauses. And then from there, we scrape the values of the wage floors that are in these clauses. And then the other sources is linked employee data, which is an annual survey that covers the entire formal sector. So all the analysis here are focusing on the formal sector. We're planning on expanding the paper to think about the informal sector, but we don't have any results on that now. And we're going to observe the earnings. We're going to essentially be using earnings and contracted wages for workers in December for each year. So we merge the CBAs to the establishments that are being covered. And then for the inequality analysis that I won't talk about, but I can show you some results if you're interested at the end. We use a 10% random sample of private sector workers in Scheiss. What I'll show you today is essentially going to be based on an establishment level panel that tracks yearly changes in the primary wage floor for each of these establishments. So you're going to see kind of the evolution of wage floor. So essentially, the impact we're going to be measuring here is the impact of a wage floor conditional on being coverage by some collective bargaining agreement. So how do we sort of study this question? So you can think of kind of the distribution of workers by wage. This sort of like a counterfactual distribution. You can think of it, this is just hypothetical, could be this shape. And then we introduce a wage floor at this value WF that essentially what you would observe in the data is a missing mass of jobs right below the wage floor and then excess mass of jobs above. This is a pretty neat figure that actually is kind of stolen from the Cengiz and co-authors paper in the QJE. But essentially you can check the differences in these masses to think about the employment effects, and these are very localized effects, causal effects of any, let's say, increase in the wage floor. One of the things we're going to focus on in this case, since we're going to think about coverage and enforcement, is kind of this section here, right? Usually many papers think of this just as noise, but we're going to treat this seriously. There are some workers that are not covered by the wage floor. So is this driven by weak enforcement, or is it the wage floor policy itself kind of leaves some workers behind? So in addition to looking at these changes in employment, we want to also think of wage floor coverage effects, which are essentially the outcome we're going to be thinking of is a share of workers that are at or above the wage floor. So essentially there was perfect enforcement and universal coverage of the wage floor, this statistic would be 100%. You wouldn't see any green mass on the left. So going to the data, what I'm going to show you here is this is raw data looking at establishments that have their primary wage floor, so in our sample. And what I'm showing you here is those that have wage floors that are essentially 10 log points, less than 10 log points away from the minimum wage. And you can see sort of, significant bunching right where you would expect. But when you move to higher buckets, so 10 to 20, 20 to 30, you sort of see this moment kind of like tracking the wage floor, which is, this is evidence that we can use kind of like a bunching analysis. And also there's evidence that the higher wage floors seem less binding. So kind of when you go up to these very high wage floors, there is kind of like a higher kind of tail here to the left. So this is all just descriptive. How are we going to think about this causally? So we're going to use a bunching and difference of difference design. Essentially, the treated are going to be groups of establishments that experience a similar event. An event is going to be an increase in the wage floor in a specific event year. And then the control are going to be defined in relation to a treated. So these are also going to be a group of establishments that are similar to the treated group. So similar is going to mean that they're in the same microregion industry cell, that have close pre-period wage floors. So they are covered by wage floors, and they're actually in the same bin of 40 reais as the treated, but they don't experience any event in the years after. So essentially, it's a set of clean controls, which kind of allows us to avoid certain issues in kind of like the new diff and diff literature. So we're going to have a stack difference and difference design that's pooling all wage floor events. We're going to have some outcome for group of establishments S in time relative to the event tau for event H. And for some of the outcomes, so essentially for the employment outcomes, we're going to run separate regressions for different wage bins. So essentially you can think count of employment by different wage bins relative to the floor. And you can plot for each of these wage bins essentially the diff and diff effect, which is the interaction of treatment with the year relative, the fixed effect for the year relative to treatment. And then we have all the usual kind of fixed effects following from that. So I'll first show you the effects on employment, and then I'm going to show you the effects on other outcomes where essentially they're not going to be bin specific. There's just a diff and diff for, let's say, mean earnings for white workers versus mean earnings for non-white workers. So let's jump first on the kind of the employment effects. So here I'm going to show you the short run impacts on the wage distribution. So essentially I'm just plotting the alpha for tau 0, so the short run effect, separately for each of these bins, and then separately for white workers and non-white workers. So essentially what you see here is in the short run, very localized effects on employment right around bin 0. So bin 0 is where the new wage floor is. So you see a missing mass and then an excess mass to the right. And you don't see anything elsewhere in the distribution, which kind of like hints the fact that this is an impact of quite convincingly, it is an impact from the wage floor. When we look kind of at the cumulative effects, which is essentially plotted by this gold line, we find null employment effects in the short run. And then it's in this kind of stage where we can look at how the amenities change by essentially looking at how the different clauses are changing, and we don't find any like substantial evidence of some amenity kind of like being removed. But how do you think about the long run effects? So for the long run effects, what I'm going to show you here is again separately for white and non-white workers. We're going to plot now the dynamic alphas, so the alphas for each tau, separately for essentially the bins just below, which is going to be this B, the bins just below, and those just above A, the new wage floor. So essentially, what we see is quite neatly is kind of evidence that there's not kind of like a differential trends between the treated and control. The kind of effects are close to 0 prior to the wage floor event. And then for the bins just above, you see this increase. And for those below, you see a decrease kind of in the count of employment. And when you sum these two, essentially, you again get null employment effects in the long run. One interesting fact is that you actually see that, comparing these numbers for the non-white versus the white workers, that the impact on non-white workers, or at least not necessarily the impact, but at least the shift in the mass of workers is larger, indicating that non-white workers are kind of more represented in that kind of lower part of the wage distribution. So now to think of how does this translate to earnings and the earnings distribution? These are going to be the difference kind of regression results. Essentially, each of the points here are going to be just the simple coefficient for the regression, the interaction of treatment with a post period dummy. And we're going to show this for white workers, non-white workers, and then the racial gap, which is essentially going to be just the outcome variable is going to be the statistic for white minus non-white workers. So first here in our bunching sample, we actually find no impact on mean earnings. I mean, there is an increase, but it's noisy. I can't rule out that they're equal to 0. But we do see quite significant compression from below. So the 50 to 10 log earnings ratio is decreasing. Now, one of the potential reasons why this is not happening anything at the mean is that it's also a quite localized effect, but also the fact that even though the wage floor is increasing for both white and non-white workers, there are some workers that are left behind from the policy, and quite more significantly so for non-white workers. So then what we do is, okay, so let's assume that this wage floor policy should be universal and that it's perfectly enforced. So essentially we do a simulation sample where we assume a general floor and full compliance. And in this sample, we do see increase in the mean earnings. So now there is a shock in the mean for both white and non-white workers. The impact is a reduction in the racial gap, but it's again not, I can't rule out that it's 0. It's noisy. Again, the compression is the same, and then quite mechanically, the wage floor coverage, you see a positive impact on wage floor coverage. Again, the impact is greater for non-white workers, indicating that they are kind of the ones that tend to be kind of left behind by this policy. So then in the last 6 minutes that I have, I'm going to talk about how we try to think of this mechanism of why non-white workers are kind of like not as impacted by these increases in wage floors. So it's actually going to be a different diff strategy, but thinking about worker transition. So now our sort of time dimension of interest is P, and you can think of P as a set of 2 periods that are going to be representing a transition from 2 of the taus. So this is essentially P equals 0 is a transition from the year before the event to the year of the event. And then we can bin workers by their, what we observed in their earnings as those that are just below or just above the wage floor. So then what we're asking is, where are the workers that are near the wage floor coming from? And is this changing once the increase in the wage floor is introduced, right? So essentially the regression that I'll be showing you here is going to be, now it's at the individual level I for period P, and thinking about a bin K, so those just below or just above. So an indicator of whether you're hired versus an incumbent. Again, the same kind of interaction of treatment with the period dummies. And then the nice thing here is you can, since now it's at the individual level, I'm going to actually include fixed effects for the establishment, fixed effects for the kind of group of establishment that this individual is belonging to. And also I can add occupation fixed effects to see whether that is kind of driving the results. For the racial differentials, which is what we're interested in, if we're actually going to interact a dummy for a non-white worker with basically with this factor here. And then to think about whether it's a union policy or not, as I mentioned before, we're going to add occupation fixed effects. So, so here is the table. So this impact here is going to be, the baseline is a white worker. So this is the impact on white workers. This is going to be the differential between white and non-white workers. And then the sum of the coefficients is giving you the impact for non-white workers. We're going to show without occupation fixed effects, with occupation fixed effects, and then focusing on the bin just below and just above of the wage floor. So what we see is kind of an overrepresentation of non-white workers that are being hired just below, and an overrepresentation of white workers that are just above, and significantly different in both cases. When we add the occupation fixed effect, essentially this doesn't die out, which kind of indicates that this differential is not really driven by the way the union policy is designed, but that rather seems to be an issue with enforcement. So to conclude, this paper thinks about the fact that there's large evidence that collective bargaining can reduce inequality, but there is little evidence outside high-income countries. Most of these papers are kind of focused in the US or Europe. So we studied collective bargaining in Brazil, where actually we find that union premiums are larger for white than non-white workers, which is something that's unusual. This is actually a part of the paper that we want to explore further, because we really can't rule, since coverage is establishment level characteristic, it's hard to tease out how much of that premium is driven by, a firm fixed effect versus a union fixed effect. So that this is one of the directions where the paper is going to be going, to see whether, this what I would now call a stylized fact actually holds when you're able to tease out that difference. So, but regardless, based on this motivation that we see kind of from replicating Ashenfelter 1972 to Brazil, is to examine one of the key union policies, which are these union negotiated wage floors. What we find is that with an increase in the wage floor, there is no reduction in the earnings gap within these covered establishments. We find that discretionary enforcement of the policy seems to be limiting the effects that it could have in inequality. So, whatever the employer is doing with regards to hiring is kind of getting rid of the potential effects that it could have. And in particular, what we find is that non-white hires are those that are more likely to slip from coverage of these wage floors. Now, this evidence is very different from the evidence that you might find on other wage floors, like the minimum wage. So one of the things that this paper kind of speaks to is that, having a tailored design policy like the minimum wage, that it's specific to every bargaining unit. You could actually, some of them can be occupation specific, and it's not something that's like really enforceable by the federal government, let's say, as opposed to a minimum wage that essentially is like a blanket policy for everyone, and it's easy to monitor. It seems like this type of policy is not, as effective as other evidence from the minimum wage. So kind of like going forward, what this project is trying to think of is what's driving this gap in premiums. As I mentioned, this is something we want to explore further by teasing out the, separating the establishment fixed effect from the union fixed effect. And then try to think whether there's spillovers to workers that are not covered, right? Even though 50% of workers the private workforce are covered, there could be spillovers to other sectors, and particularly the informal sector. The impact on inequality, if you think of an insider-outsider model, might be even more substantial once you consider those types of effects. So that's kind of like where we're thinking about taking this paper forward. So thank you. I think I'm just in time, and I'll open it up to questions. It seems like Guillermo has a question. Go ahead.
Hi, Lorenzo. Thanks for the presentation. My comments, it's a bit of a follow-up on your last point on the topic of maybe spillovers between covered and union members and covered. There's this literature, especially for Europe. They compare countries with high union coverage and high also agreement coverage, like Nordic countries, and then Southern Europe. You have this divergence, like the one you see in Brazil. We see this same thing in Uruguay, where this is where I'm from. So I was wondering if we could use this, this literature. Basically, we are talking about divergence of interest between potential divergence of interest between union members and uncovered workers. Typically, people think about employment effects of this. I wonder if you could think of that type of framework to think about your problem here in Brazil. Basically, we're thinking of maybe if you have data on racial composition of unions versus non-union workers, could there be something about it there?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think kind of where we're trying to contribute in that regard is to so we don't really observe. We can use the household survey to think about union membership. That's where the union membership comes from. In the case of Brazil, it's hard to think about what union membership really means. My current interpretation of that, since you're covered, essentially becoming a union member means you pay kind of like an additional due, and that gives you like additional benefits. like, my understanding is, for example, you could like use the gym that they provide, or other features that are outside the collective bargaining agreement. So there we can think about race differentials, but when it comes to CBA coverage, which is kind of like the main thing that we're observing there, it's complicated. Now, we are trying to think about separating kind of, and we could do this by race, kind of the strategy we're trying to think about is doing kind of like I don't know if you're familiar kind of with the AKM literature, but think about creating a model kind of identified from worker transitions from employment to employment, where you could have a fixed effect for the establishment, but then also since unions or essentially can cover more than one establishment, be able to separate the effect of that. And we could potentially do that separately by race. So that's kind of the direction we're going to exploring, which I think will be neat in the sense that I think we can take care of a lot of selection effects that kind of plague the literature when you think about union membership as a statistic that matters, right? Because people select into being a union, whereas people selecting into a job because of the union, I think that's kind of attenuated in some regard. But all good comments. I think that's where we're hoping to take the paper towards, and just I think there's a comparative advantage for the Brazilian data to kind of contribute in that regard. Thank you. We have 1 minute. I don't know if Claire is here.
Yes, I'm here, Lorenzo.
Okay, awesome. I think you can share your screen if there's no other question.
Can everyone see my screen now? All right, should I start, Lorenzo?
Go ahead.
So hi, everyone. I'm delighted to present new work on racial inequality, minimum wage spillovers, and the informal sector. I'm joining from rainy California today. It's rare, a rare event here. So this paper is joined with my fabulous co-authors, Laura Derenoncourt, François Gérard, and Lorenzo. The starting point of the paper is that many post-slavery, post-colonial societies are characterized by persistence and large racial economic disparities. You can think of large, yes?
One thing, we can see just your kind of title slide. I don't know if you clicked after that.
Yeah, okay, so that's a problem because so it's moving well on my screen.
Yeah, we don't see any movement here.
So trying to find what the problem can be. Let me redo that. Sorry, everyone, for that.
That looks good. I'll click once. Yeah, excellent.
Okay. I don't know what happened. So the starting point of the paper is that you have these large racial economic disparities in post-colonial and post-slavery societies. You can think of large racial poverty gaps persisting, but also large racial earnings gaps persisting in the labor market. The question we are addressing in this paper is how effective is the minimum wage at reducing these types of disparities? And the broader question that we're trying to address is how effective are universal labor standards? So like the minimum wage, like collective bargaining, effective at reducing between group inequalities by contrast with targeted policies, whether you think of anti-discrimination policies, reparations, or racial quotas, for example. So the answer to our question of interest here is far from being obvious. There are kind of two competing effects. There are two main effects of the minimum wage on inequality. So first of all, you might think that the minimum wage is able to reduce wage inequality and in particular racial wage gaps at the bottom of the distribution. if non-white workers are overrepresented in that part of the distribution. Yes, this is the case if you are in a world where firms are complying with the minimum wage, and in particular, if we're talking about the formal sector. But in an economy with a large informal sector, things might be more complicated. The second effect we want to talk about is the displacement effects of the minimum wage. And here we're thinking broadly of a displacement effect from employment to non-employment, which is the classical margin. But in the context of an economy with a large informal sector, we are also interested in displacement effects from the formal sector to the informal sectors, because you might think that employers are going to switch workers to informal contracts, and they might do so differently for non-white workers. Okay, so we study this question in the context of Brazil. Why? Just because it's an ideal setting for us for 4 reasons. First of all, there's a persistence of large racial disparities in Brazil, and it's due to the legacy of slavery. Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery in 1888. Second, there is a large informal sector in Brazil where non-white workers are overrepresented. Just to give you one number, there's 40% of the private workforce with no formal contract in 2009. Brazil also underwent very large nationwide minimum wage increases in the 2000s under Cardoso and Lula. The fourth reason is that Brazil has a very rich microdata. In this project, we're using a lot the labor force survey data and the census data, because they have both the information on formality and informality. We're also using the universe of the linked employer-employee data to double check basically what we're doing in the formal sector with the other types of data. Our big result in this paper is that, yes, the minimum wage hikes in the 2000s were able to reduce racial earnings gap, but also racial income gaps in Brazil. We are documenting first a reduction in wage inequality among formal workers. I'm going to get that into more detail. The second finding that we have, and probably that's the core of our paper, is that the minimum wage increases wages in the informal sector as well. So I'm going to spend some time in this presentation to present this result. And in particular, we find that there's almost a full pass-through, an 80% pass-through of the minimum wage increases into the informal sector. And on the displacement of workers, we do not find any evidence of large disemployment or reallocations to the informal sector or to other or to non-employment. So at the end of the presentation, we're going to take some time to discuss the implications for how what that set of results mean for the functioning of the labor market in Brazil. All right, we are making 3 contributions. Maybe one of the advances of the paper is to show the role of the minimum wage on racial wage inequality at different percentiles of the distribution, and documenting the pattern at the bottom, middle, and top of the income distributions. Of course, there's a very large literature on the minimum wage in Brazil. One of the last papers on this topic was Engboom and Moser in 2021, focusing on the formal sector only. So here we are taking this question of the effect of the minimum wage on wage inequality to the entire economy. And that leads me to our second contribution, in which we are uncovering the role of the minimum wage on informal jobs, and conclude that there are large, what we call spillover effects of the minimum wage to informal jobs, to uncovered jobs. And the third contribution is to try to quantify the role of the minimum wage in racial income inequality and poverty gaps in middle income countries, and contribute to the broader debate on the role of domestic or government policies versus trade policies, for example, in reducing wage inequality. All right, let me talk a little bit more about the context before we document the role of the minimum wage on reducing racial inequality in the formal sector. than the informal one before discussing the displacement effects. So as you can see on this graph, there's on the left axis, you can see the raw racial earnings gap in the formal labor markets among prime age workers. And what you can see is that there's one episode of decline in racial inequality in Brazil. It's happening between 1995 and 2010. And it's a big decline of 15 log points. And when I'm talking about the racial gap here, I'm talking about the difference in earnings, in log monthly earnings between white and non-white workers. And by non-white workers, I'm pulling together people of mixed race and Black people. So what's interesting in this graph is that there's a coincidence in the timing between the decline in racial inequality and this rise of the minimum wage. As you can see on the right y-axis, the minimum wage to median ratio went from about 30% in 1999 to above 50% 10 years later. So that's comparable to going from the current low US federal minimum wage to median ratio to the high French minimum wage to median ratio in just about 10 years. The minimum wage is federal in Brazil, and it's set in monthly terms, and it has to be approved by the president, at least until 2008. So beyond the coincidence in the timing, what's interesting with the richness of the Brazilian data is that you can plot precisely the monthly earnings distributions by racial group. To see exactly where in the distribution the minimum wage is affecting the dynamics of wages. So here I'm showing you monthly earnings distributions plotted using the labor force surveys. On the y-axis, you have the log monthly wage beans in 10 log points beans. And on the left, on the y-axis, you have the share of workers by race. So if you were to integrate the line below the green curve, you would have 100% of non-white workers in the formal sector in 1995, and same thing for the white workers. So a few things to note on this graph. We are in 1995 in the formal sector. What you can see is that there's a very large spike at the bottom of the distribution here. It corresponds to where the minimum wage binds. You can see that non-white workers are overrepresented at the minimum wage. And you can also see that there's virtually no workers reporting that they have wages below the minimum wage. So there is full compliance with the minimum wage in the formal sector in Brazil in 1995. And the third thing that I want to mention is that the minimum wage here is binding at around the 10th percentile at the national level. So I'm going to play the video so that you can see how the minimum wage is affecting the wage distribution. So not much is happening between 1995 and 1999 in terms of shape of the wage distribution. But starting in 2001, you can see that the spike at the minimum wage is really increasing, and it peaks actually in 2000. It peaks in 2009. When approximately 25% of non-white workers, more than 25% of non-white workers are paid at the minimum wage or within 10% of the minimum wage. All right, so we're taking those graphs to the next level to document, to quantify the role of the minimum wage on the white, non-white earnings level gaps. So what we're doing here is that instead of plotting the monthly earnings distributions, we are plotting the CDFs of monthly earnings. And by following the methodology of Bayer and Charles in their 2018 QGA paper, we use quantile regressions to estimate racial earnings level gaps at different percentiles. So here we are interested in, I'm showing you the racial earnings level gaps at the 10th percentile and the 50th percentile, so way above the 10th percentile. And then the reason why we are looking at what's happening at the 10th percentile is because, again, the minimum wage was binding at the 10th percentile at the national level. So if we expect to see the action of the minimum wage at this point in the wage distribution. So in 1995, again, in the formal sector, the racial gap is 40 log points, and it's the same thing at the median. And you can see that as the minimum wage is increasing, the racial earnings level gap at the 10th percentile is going to shrink to basically 0 in 2006, and it's going to stay at 0 until the end of our period of interest. And this results because the minimum wage binds approximately at the 10th percentile for white workers and above the 10th percentile for non-white workers. So wrapping up on this section, we find that the minimum wage is the eraser of the racial earnings gaps at the 10th percentile nationally, at the 15th percentiles in states with high initial minimum wage to median ratios. And we also find that these reforms have led to a pattern of racial inequality that is completely reversed to the US. So basically in Brazil, you have very small racial gaps at the bottom, essentially 0, and large racial gaps at the top, and it's the reverse in the US. All right, so what's happening in the informal sector? On this section, I want to take some time to say that we're talking about what we're focusing today on informal salaried employees. So the 40% of the 45% of salaried employees, and the rest are self-employed among those workers with an informal contract. We document 3 stylized facts in the paper about the informal sector. First of all, the informal workers' wages are responding to the minimum wage increases. I'm just showing you a graph to show you the extent of the spike of the minimum wage among salaried workers in 2015. The second stylized fact that we document is that non-white workers are overrepresented in the informal sector. So whenever we're talking about racial inequality, it's important to take into account what's happening in the informal sector. And the third fact that we document is that among informal workers, non-compliance is concentrated among those that work at informal firms. So very quickly, I want to show you this graph. So here we are plotting the monthly earnings distributions among informal employees, and we separate those working at informal firms and those working at informal firms. And you can see that there is non-compliance here in the minimum wage that is concentrated among only those that are working in informal firms. So keep that in the back of your mind for the interpretation of our results. And what we do in this section is that we quantify the extent of the spillover effects using a definitive design. Our first step is to document the effect of the minimum wage on average earnings in the formal sector. To do this, we use a cross-state definitive design. We're comparing states that are highly impacted by the minimum wage, and those are defined as states with a minimum wage to median ratio that is high above the median in 1999 versus the weakly treated states. It's a very standard definitive. We are adding, including a set of individual level controls, which actually do not change our results. And of course, our identification assumption is that absent those 2000-2009 reforms, the earnings in the 2 types of states would have evolved similarly. We do, in fact, find that the parallel assumptions hold on this graph. And you can see that when we're plotting the beta K of the equation here, you can see that the overall effect is approximately 11 log points by 2009. So there's a progressive increase in average earnings in the strongly treated states relative to the weakly treated states starting in 2001. We do a number of robustness checks in the paper. In particular, we are doing that one, which is comparing what's happening in the bottom of the distribution, the bottom 80%, and the top 20% of the distributions. And we can see that the effects are concentrated in the part of the distribution that is not affected by the minimum wage increases, which is below P80 according to Bohm and Moser in 2021. We're also checking that the effects are concentrated among low education workers. And in a version of the paper that we are currently working on, we are also showing that these results are robust to other definitions of the treatment variable, for example, the fraction of affected workers. When we take these regressions to a finer levels, like industry by state or industry by micro regions, our results hold as well, so that we don't think that there are sectoral shocks that can confound our results here. And we also find consistent results in RICE, in the linked employer-employee data and the census data. Okay, so here I'm showing you our results in a table. The monthly earnings effects among formal workers is 11%. It's 9% among informal workers, which means when you take the ratio between the two, that our cross-sector wage elasticity is 80%. And it's the same thing across racial groups, basically. I'm gonna go fast on this section. Basically, we are using our same definitive design, and we do not find any significant effect of reallocation from the formal to the informal sector. This is what we capture in this table by the cross-sector employment elasticity, which is 0.13. What this means is that a 10% increase in the average earnings of formal workers is leading to an increase informality rates of 1.3%, but this is not statistically significant. And actually the lower bound here is minus 0.16. And when you think about the magnitude of these results, you should have in mind elasticities to unemployment in the minimum wage literature that are considered small if they are smaller than minus 0.4. All right, and I'm going to conclude on this slide. Lorenzo, I know that I have 1 minute or less. Just to think about how do we interpret the combination of our results of a large wage increase in the informal sector and at the same time no reallocations to the informal sector. So this is not consistent with a dual view of the labor market, of segmented labor markets in which the minimum wage increases are leading to reallocation of the lowest productivity workers to the informal sector. Instead, it's more consistent with an integrated view of the labor market between the informal and the formal sectors, following Megia et al. And there are three assumptions for why this might happen that we're currently working on. First of all, it might be the case that firms are competing from the same workers, whether they are formal or informal, and we have some evidence of this. We are currently pushing the paper in that direction to show that the competitive margin might explain our set of results. I could talk a little bit more about that.
Claire, you have 5 more minutes. It's not.
Oh, I have 5 more minutes. Okay,
yeah,
sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me talk a little bit about what we're doing to address this this question. So we are currently computing the transition rates between formal and the informal sector in the pre-period. And what we want to do is to compare the extent of the minimum wage spillovers to the informal sector in 2 types of labor markets that are characterized by transition rates from the formal to the informal sector that are high, and the extent of the spillover effects in other types of labor markets where transition rates are low. And if we find that the spillover effects are higher in labor markets with high transition rates from formal to informal, that will be evidence that there is an active competition for the same workers, and that there is a productivity overlap between the formal and the informal sector. So that's one thing that we are trying to formally test. Actually, we do have some descriptive results, early descriptive results on this, I'm going to show you that formal workers and informal workers who are working at those formal firms, which is something that we can disentangle in the labor force surveys from 2012 to 2015, you can see that these two types of workers are actually working in the same types of industries. So basically here, the distribution of the share of workers across industries in the formal sector and in the informal sector on this intensive, what is called the intensive margin of informality are very close. By contrast, we need to separate the informal workers who are working at informal firms. They have a completely different profile. So we're going to try to show that there is, a lot of competition among those two types of workers here. All right. The second assumption that might, explain our results is that maybe there's a greater enforcement or threat of enforcement can, explain the extent of our spillover effects to the informal sector. So here, what we're doing to empirically test this assumption is to compare the extent of the spillover effects in labor markets where you have a greater threat of enforcement versus what's happening in others. And we are proxying greater enforcement by the distance between the establishment and the nearest labor office, as has been done by Ponzek and Ulisea recently. And we're doing this in the census data to go at the micro region level. And the third, explanation that might, explain those large spillover effects and the no reallocation effects is that maybe the minimum wage is acting as a norm in the labor market. It can come both from the supply side or the demand side. But I have here, what I'm showing you is the monthly earnings distributions in 2015 among all salaried workers. So the informal and the formal workers, we are stacking them together. They have different colors here. But what's interesting here is that we have spikes that are appearing at values that are multiples of the minimum wage. So it's possible that the minimum wage is really acting as a norm in this labor market. What we're trying to do is to take these graphs to a thinner level in the census and in the RICE data, because maybe this is just reporting, just a reporting phenomenon. All right. We are also finding no displacement effect from employment to non-employment, and we are also doing a number of robustness checks, in particular taking into account Bolsa Familia. We don't find any effect of Bolsa Familia reducing labor supply in the Northeast region, and that's consistent with recent evidence by François and Gérard and co-authors. And let me conclude very quickly. So what we show in the paper is that the minimum wage closed the racial income gap at the bottom of the distribution in Brazil. Second, the minimum wage is improving conditions in the informal sector as well. And this is consistent with strategic competition among informal and formal employers, and with the minimum wage acting as a norm. And it's possible, more fundamentally, that the role of the minimum wage in the reduction of inequality and poverty may have been underestimated if it spills over so strongly to the informal sector. So a broad conclusion is that the minimum wage may also be one of the rare policy tools that we have, and that might be able to influence the informal sector in the short run. Thank you.
Any questions? People are free to raise their hands. I can't ask a question because I'm a co-author. So it's the okay.
Lorenzo, no, just a quick comment. It's not really a question. I really like this your line of work. Just to add that this phenomenon of the minimum wage and the informal sector wage, you see it also in most countries in Latin America. Just to add on that, and I think it's great that you're working on that because it's it has been for a while a big puzzle, I think, but it's something that certainly you not only see in Brazil, you see in many countries, which another characteristic of Latin America is that the minimum wage is pretty high in many countries and for international standards, and you see this impact on the informal sector wage too.
So Guillermo, can I ask a question actually? So in which country in Latin America would you be able to have very precise data on the informal sector? So I know Brazil has pretty good data on the informal sector. What other countries would have this quality of data?
You can check this in the household surveys. Official household surveys are fine in most countries. And you see this. I can send you later some references on we have done some work on this at CAF at the bank, and just looking at these densities and then the minimum wage. But in general, household surveys are good in all countries. And even in some countries you also have these short panels. I think maybe the graph Maria Elena showed at the beginning maybe were from there. In Mexico, you have a short panel. In Argentina also, and you can see basically you have the question in the survey if the worker does if there are social security contributions in the job.
And Mexico is one of those cases that actually had a very, very low minimum wage, and currently they're starting to try to ramp it up a little bit. So our findings are actually quite relevant to what's happening there.
Yeah. One other thing, that I find interesting here as well is that I haven't had time to show that, sorry. But all the monthly earnings distributions with that huge spike that we see at the minimum wage, actually we do see that in the RICE data as well. So here I'm showing you very quickly. But in 2009, for example, if we take the household survey and you look at the spike at the minimum wage, it's really the same thing when we're talking the contracted wage in the RICE. Now, the problem of the linked employees data is that it's only on the formal sector. But in Brazil, there's this Equinef survey, which has basically those establishment surveys in 1997 and 2003, where you have this type of info for both formal and informal firms. So I was also wondering if there are other, of course, it would be great to have that every year, but it's not the case in Brazil, but we can cross-check what's happening in the informal sector as well using these establishment surveys. I was wondering if there was any equivalent in other Latin American countries.
Yeah, no, that type of data with informal firms, I think that would be hard. I was thinking mostly on household survey, which you can see this. Right. Another thing you see in all countries is this spike also not only at the minimum wage, but twice and thrice. You also see that everywhere, or at least in many countries.
All right.
Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for participating. It was actually a great session. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, I hope you have fun and see you around in other sessions. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.